Iran shouldn't survive. The combination of economic collapse, youth unemployment, international isolation, and repeated mass protests would topple most regimes. The Islamic Republic faces pressures that destroyed the Soviet Union, triggered Arab Spring revolutions, and collapsed authoritarian systems across Latin America and Asia. Yet Iran endures. 45 years after revolution, through 8 years of war with Iraq, decades of sanctions, multiple protest waves, and economic devastation, the regime persists. This isn't accident or luck. Iran has developed regime resilience model that turns protests from existential threat into manageable pressure, a trap where protests are permitted to occur at controlled intensity that releases social pressure without threatening regime survival. The protests are real, the grievances are legitimate, the repression is brutal, but the system is designed to survive protest cycles rather than prevent them. The regime doesn't stop protests, it manages them. Security forces kill enough protesters to restore order, but not so many that international intervention becomes likely or domestic coup becomes preferable to continued repression. Economic conditions are allowed to deteriorate but not collapse completely, keeping population desperate enough to avoid organizing, but not so desperate that revolution becomes only option. Regional conflicts are escalated when domestic pressure builds, redirecting attention from internal failures to external threats. The protest trap is that opposition cannot win through street protests alone because regime has calibrated repression to survive protest cycles indefinitely. But opposition also cannot stop protesting because economic and political conditions make continuation of regime intolerable. The result is permanent instability. That regime survives through sophisticated authoritarian governance that most observers underestimate. Understanding how Iran survives requires examining the specific mechanisms of controlled instability, why they work when similar systems failed elsewhere, and whether the model is sustainable or merely delaying inevitable collapse. The controlled release valve concept is central to regime strategy. Authoritarian regimes face choice between total repression, preventing any dissent, or allowing limited dissent as pressure release. Total repression works if regime has resources for comprehensive surveillance and enforcement. North Korea model where population is atomized and any organization is impossible. But total repression is expensive and creates pressure that eventually explodes catastrophically if control ever slips. The alternative is allowing limited protests that release pressure, identify opposition leaders, and create illusion that change is possible through protest. Iran chose the latter approach after learning from 1979 revolution that total repression under Shah created conditions for revolution. The management technique is calibrated violence. When protests begin, regime initially allows them to grow to several 100,000 participants in major cities. This identifies opposition base, maps communication networks, and allows security forces to prepare response. Then violence escalates gradually. First police with batons and tear gas, then Basij militias with live ammunition. Finally, IRGC if protests threaten to overwhelm initial response. The killing happens in stages so that protesters have opportunities to retreat. Those who continue protesting after initial violence are marked as hardcore opposition who must be eliminated. Those who retreat after seeing violence are intimidated but not arrested. The calibration maintains fear while avoiding mass martyrdom that could radicalize broader population. The 2009 Green Movement demonstrates the technique. Initial protests following disputed presidential election drew millions into streets peacefully. Regime allowed protests to continue for weeks while monitoring participants through surveillance and informants. Then crackdown began with targeted arrests of identified leaders. Mousavi and Karoubi placed under house arrest, hundreds of activists arrested. Street violence escalated gradually with approximately 70 killed over several months. The limited death toll was enough to suppress protests without creating massacre that would trigger international intervention. The opposition was left alive but neutralized. Leaders imprisoned, supporters intimidated, Organization disrupted. The movement failed, but opposition survival meant some hope remained, preventing total desperation that drives revolution. The 2022 Mahsa Amini protests showed regime adapting the technique for leaderless movements. Without identifiable leaders to arrest, regime couldn't decapitate movement, so it focused on systematic arrest of thousands of participants, execution of dozens as examples, and targeted killings of prominent protesters. The death toll of several hundred was higher than 2009, but still limited compared to Syrian or Chinese repression. The internet shutdowns prevented coordination, but weren't total blackouts that would cripple economy. The calibration was finding minimum violence necessary to suppress protests without triggering coup or intervention. The regional conflict escalation serves as domestic distraction. When internal pressure builds, regime escalates external conflicts to rally nationalist sentiment and justify repression as national security necessity. The pattern is consistent. 2011 Arab Spring threatened to spread to Iran. Regime responded by deepening Syrian intervention, presenting it as defending Shia populations. The 2017-2018 economic protests correlated with increased Iranian activity in Yemen and Iraq. The 2022 protests occurred as Russia-Ukraine war intensified, with Iran providing drones to Russia and escalating against Israel through proxies. The external conflicts aren't random. They're timed to divert attention from domestic failures. The Syria intervention timing is revealing. Syrian civil war began March 2011 during Arab Spring wave that toppled Tunisia, Egypt, and threatened other regimes. Iranian domestic opposition hoped Arab Spring would inspire Iranian protests. Regime response was twofold: brutal suppression of any domestic protest attempt and massive intervention in Syria portrayed as defending Shia communities and preventing Western-backed regime change. By 2012, Iran was spending billions annually supporting Assad IRGC forces, Hezbollah deployments, economic aid, and weapons shipments. The intervention diverted billions from domestic spending but was presented as necessary resistance to Western imperialism. The framing was sophisticated. Syria wasn't foreign adventure. It was defending axis of resistance against Western plots. Iranian casualties in Syria were presented as martyrs defending Islam rather than deaths in foreign civil war. When economic protests erupted in Iran 2017-2018, protesters chanted, "Leave Syria, think about us." The slogan revealed that population understood Syria intervention was draining resources needed domestically. But regime doubled down, arguing that defending Syria was protecting Iran from Western encirclement. The nationalist framing resonated with some Iranians even as economy suffered. The drone supply to Russia 2022 served similar function. As Mahsa Amini protests intensified, regime deepened Russia relationship by providing hundreds of drones used in Ukraine. The West condemned Iranian drone exports and threatened additional sanctions. Regime portrayed this as defending Iranian sovereignty against Western dictates about who Iran can trade with. The framing shifted conversation from domestic repression to international independence. Some Iranians opposed to regime domestically supported drone sales as assertion of Iranian strategic autonomy. The contradiction allowed regime to maintain support among nationalists while repressing protesters. The nationalist rallying works because many Iranians oppose regime domestically, but support resistance to Western pressure internationally. The contradictory views are sustainable because domestic issues and international issues are presented as separate. An Iranian can believe economic mismanagement deserves protest while also believing Iran should resist American pressure and support Palestinians. The regime exploits this by escalating international conflicts when domestic pressure builds, attempting to shift focus from economic failure to national pride and external threats. The IRGC economic control creates stakeholder class with interest in regime survival beyond ideological commitment. Approximately 40% of Iranian economy is controlled by IRGC and affiliated foundations through front companies, monopolies, and preferential contracts. This creates a network of businessmen, contractors, and managers whose wealth depends on regime continuation. The stakeholder class numbers hundreds of thousands, including families, millions of Iranians who benefit materially from regime, even if they dislike its ideology. These stakeholders won't join protests because regime change threatens their economic position. They provide regime with middle-class support base that economic performance alone wouldn't generate. The foundation economy exemplifies this mechanism. Charitable foundations called bonyads control vast assets confiscated after revolution: real estate, factories, agricultural land. The foundations are tax-exempt and answerable only to supreme leader. They employ hundreds of thousands and control approximately 20% of GDP. Setad, the most powerful foundation, has assets estimated at $95 billion. The foundation employees and beneficiaries are economically dependent on regime. They might want political reforms, but won't support revolution that could eliminate foundations employing them. The regime deliberately expanded foundation economy to create economic dependencies that supplement ideological support. Setad's operations reveal the scale of foundation control. Formally named headquarters for executing the order of the Imam, Setad was established in 1989 to manage properties confiscated from Iranians who fled revolution or were executed. The initial assets were valued at $100 million through legal mechanisms allowing seizure of abandoned properties and shrewd investment. Setad grew to control assets worth $95+ billion by Reuters investigation in 2013. The portfolio includes apartment buildings in Tehran worth billions, agricultural land producing food for domestic consumption and export, factories manufacturing everything from cars to pharmaceuticals, telecommunications infrastructure, and oil industry assets. Setad operates approximately 30 companies across construction, telecommunications, energy, automotive, mining, and financial services. Sina Bank, controlled by Setad, has assets exceeding $10 billion. Mobin Petroleum operates oil fields and refineries. The empire generates billions annually in revenue that flows to Supreme Leader's office without parliamentary oversight or public accounting. The opacity means nobody outside regime knows exactly how much Setad controls or how revenue is spent. But employees know their salaries come from Setad. Suppliers know Setad provides contracts, and beneficiaries know Setad funds pensions and charitable distributions. The economic dependency extends beyond direct employment. Construction companies depend on Setad contracts. Real estate developers need Setad approval for projects on land Setad controls. Banks need Setad deposits. The network of dependencies creates millions with indirect economic stakes in regime continuation. These stakeholders won't risk their livelihood supporting protests that threaten foundation system funding their income. The economic trap is that many Iranians depend on wealth confiscated from revolutionary enemies, binding them to regime that seized the wealth. The succession planning creates continuity, ensuring individual leaders' death doesn't trigger regime crisis. Khamenei is 85 and succession is inevitable soon. But Islamic Republic has institutional structures, Guardian Council, Assembly of Experts, Expediency Council that can manage succession. The institutions are controlled by hardliners who will select hardline successor maintaining system. Unlike monarchies where succession is hereditary and can fail if heir is weak, Iranian system allows selection of successor from pool of loyal clerics and commanders. The succession will likely create brief power struggle, but institutions ensure regime continuity, regardless of individual leader. The comparison to Soviet collapse reveals critical differences. Soviet Union collapsed when Gorbachev's reforms created expectations that system couldn't meet, when economic stagnation became undeniable, and when satellite states defected, removing empire that justified repression. But Islamic Republic doesn't promise economic prosperity. It promises Islamic governance and resistance to Western imperialism. The ideological legitimacy isn't tied to economic performance. When economy fails, regime blames sanctions rather than accepting responsibility. The lack of satellite states means no cascade of defections undermining regime. The succession system prevents Gorbachev-style reformer dismantling system from within. The Arab Spring comparison shows why Iran survived when similar regimes fell. Tunisia's Ben Ali, Egypt's Mubarak, and Libya's Gaddafi fell when protests escalated and security forces refused to massacre protesters in sufficient numbers. But those regimes were secular dictatorships without ideological foundation. Military officers decided preserving institution was more important than defending particular dictator. Iran's IRGC is ideologically committed Islamic revolutionary force, not professional military separable from regime. IRGC officers know they face prosecution if regime falls because of their role in repression and corruption. The existential stakes keep IRGC loyal in ways Egyptian military wasn't loyal to Mubarak. The international isolation paradoxically strengthens regime by eliminating vulnerability to Western pressure. Mubarak fell partly because American withdrawal of support made military question whether defending him was worth it. Iran has no such vulnerability. America already opposes regime maximally, so American pressure cannot increase. Russia and China provide diplomatic support, but no security guarantee, meaning Iran doesn't depend on them for survival. The regime is self-sufficient in repression, insulated from leverage that toppled other dictatorships. The sanctions hurt economy, but also allow regime to blame external enemies for internal failures, redirecting anger from regime toward sanctioners. The information control evolved from blocking internet to managing narrative. Iran cannot completely prevent information flow. VPNs, satellite dishes, and social media circumvent censorship. But regime developed sophisticated propaganda portraying protests as Western-backed sedition, protesters as misguided victims of foreign manipulation, and repression as defending national security. The narrative doesn't convince everyone but creates enough doubt that some Iranians question whether protests represent legitimate grievances or foreign conspiracy. The uncertainty fragments opposition and provides regime supporters with rationalization for supporting repression. The periodic reform cycles provide hope without delivering change. Iran allows periodic elections where reformist candidates compete against hardliners. The reformists promise economic improvement and social liberalization within Islamic system. When reformists win, like Khatami in 1997 or Rouhani in 2013, supporters believe change is coming. But Supreme Leader and Guardian Council veto meaningful reforms. Eventually, reformist administrations fail to deliver change. Supporters become disillusioned, and hardliners return to power. The cycle repeats. Hopes are raised, reformists win, reforms are blocked, hardliners return. The cycle channels opposition energy into electoral politics, rather than revolutionary action. Even failed reform attempts are valuable to regime because they extend illusion that change is possible through institutional means. The generational replacement strategy waits for revolutionary generation to die. Current regime leadership is aging revolutionary generation with personal investment in Islamic Republic. But younger IRGC officers and clerics have no revolutionary credentials and more pragmatic worldviews. Regime calculates that if system survives another 10-15 years until revolutionary generation dies, successor generation might negotiate relaxation of ideological restrictions in exchange for continued power. The trajectory would be Chinese model, authoritarian political control with economic and social liberalization. Whether this succeeds depends on regime surviving transition period without revolution. The protest trap closes when opposition realizes street protests alone cannot overthrow regime, but also cannot accept continued repression. The opposition is trapped between futile protest and intolerable submission. The regime is trapped between unsustainable repression and unacceptable reform. But regime's trap is sustainable longer because state controls violence and can survive economically, even in degraded condition. Opposition's trap is deteriorating because aging, emigration, and exhaustion weaken protest capacity over time. The contradiction could persist decades. Protests continue but don't succeed. Regime survives but cannot restore stability. The breaking points that could shatter the trap are identifiable, but timing is unpredictable. Khamenei's death creates succession crisis that could fracture elite unity, economic collapse so severe that government cannot pay security forces or provide basic subsidies triggers desperation revolution, military coup by pragmatic officers deciding managed transition preferable to system collapse, external shock like war with neighbors or great power intervention. Any of these could break the stalemate suddenly. But each year regime survives makes opposition weaker through emigration and exhaustion, while regime's survival mechanisms become more sophisticated. The resilience model Iran developed might be template for other authoritarian regimes facing similar pressures. The combination of calibrated repression, economic dependencies creating stakeholder classes, regional conflict distraction, information management, and reform cycle illusions could be replicated by other regimes studying Iranian survival. The model isn't pretty. It requires willingness to kill protesters periodically and accept permanent economic underperformance. But for regimes prioritizing survival over prosperity, Iranian model demonstrates that sophisticated authoritarian governance can survive pressures that conventional analysis says should be fatal. The protests continue. The repression continues. The economic decline continues. But the regime continues because it built system designed to survive exactly these pressures. The trap is complete. Opposition cannot win, regime cannot lose, and both are trapped in permanent crisis that neither can resolve. Yet the model's sustainability is questionable because it depends on variables regime cannot control. The calibrated repression requires security forces staying loyal despite killing compatriots repeatedly. Loyalty held through 2009, 2019, 2022, but will it hold through 2030, 2035, 2040? Each protest cycle requires more violence than previous one. Eventually, the required violence might exceed what security forces accept or what international community tolerates. The 2019 killing of 1,500 was unprecedented but insufficient to prevent 2022 protests. What happens when 5,000 or 10,000 must be killed? At what point does IRGC leadership decide regime change is necessary to prevent complete collapse? The economic decline has limits because regime survival requires paying security forces and maintaining minimum subsidies. If sanctions and mismanagement reduce oil revenue below threshold needed for these functions, regime faces crisis. Current oil revenue covers security forces and minimal subsidies. But if revenue drops another 50% or inflation accelerates further, the mathematics fail. Security forces won't serve for worthless currency. Population won't tolerate eliminating all subsidies. The economic floor below which regime cannot function exists somewhere above complete collapse. Iran is approaching that floor. Whether it reaches it before regime change occurs depends on unpredictable oil prices and sanction effectiveness. The succession crisis, when Khamenei dies, creates window of vulnerability. The succession institutions exist but have never been tested. The assembly of experts is supposed to select successor, but its members are elderly clerics who might not survive Khamenei by many years. If multiple assembly members die in same period, succession becomes contested. IRGC might attempt to install compliant successor or seize power directly. Hardliners and pragmatists could split into factions backing different candidates. A protracted succession struggle during economic crisis and ongoing protests could fragment elite cohesion that's maintained regime for 45 years. The succession timing is unknowable, but crisis is likely. The external intervention question remains open despite regime's attempts to prevent it. Military action against Iran's nuclear facilities by Israel or United States could trigger chain of events overwhelming regime. If strikes cause catastrophic damage and massive casualties, domestic uprising might follow, taking advantage of regime distraction. If intervention triggers regional war-forcing regime to mobilize, security forces normally suppressing protests would be deployed externally, creating openings for opposition. The regime tries to prevent intervention through nuclear ambiguity, staying below threshold that triggers attack while maintaining deterrent capability. but miscalculation could trigger intervention that regime cannot survive. The model works until it doesn't. Many authoritarian regimes appeared stable until sudden collapse. East Germany until 1989, Tunisia until 2011, Ukraine's Yanukovych until 2014. Iranian regime has survived longer than most, but survival record doesn't guarantee future survival. The resilience mechanisms are sophisticated, but face accumulating pressures that might eventually overwhelm them. The trap remains. Opposition cannot win. Regime appears unbeatable. But traps sometimes spring suddenly when accumulated pressure finds weak point nobody predicted. Iranian regime continues surviving what should break it. The question is whether it survives long enough for revolutionary generation to age out and enable transition, or whether one of the many vulnerabilities proves fatal before transition occurs.